Welcome back to the Youth in Podcast, the podcast where we discuss political ideology, policies, current day events, and more. I'm your host, Elia Amadi, and today I'm joined by Dr. Francesa Minerva. Dr. Minerva is a research fellow at the University of Warwick and a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Ghent. She is also the co-founder and co-editor at the Journal of Controversial Ideas. On this episode, we will discuss her renowned article titled Afterbirth Abortion, Why Should the Baby Live?, in which she argues for why infanticide should be deemed permissible in all cases it may occur. Dr. Minerva, it's a pleasure to have you on the show, and I'm also joined by my co-host, Alex Smith.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So, Dr. Minerva, obviously your article caused a lot of controversy when it first came out, but maybe a lot of our listeners probably don't know what exactly the article is. So can you talk a little bit about what your personal and research criteria for what considered a future life worth living as opposed to one where abortion would be a better option?
Yes, so the paper which came out about 10 years ago at this point, I think it was 2012, so 8 years ago, was addressing the issue of moral status. So philosophers take different accounts for to consider what gives moral status, which is a right to live, to different entities. And some philosophers argue that what matters in order to have a moral status is being a human being, for instance, like being part of a certain species. Others says that what matters is having certain capacities, and they disagree about which capacities are relevant. Some say that just the moral status started at the moment of conception, whereas some other ones say that it starts later on during the pregnancy, and some other ones, like myself, say it starts like after some points after birth, because there are capacities that are developed later on. So this is roughly the debate around moral status. And as I just mentioned, in that paper, we address this concern, this view, according to which the moral status of an individual has to do with some capacities they have. So the capacity to basically attribute some value to their own life, the capacity to have projects for the future. So the having the understanding that there is a future and that there are plans and that these plans will be frustrated. So like if I plan to become a philosopher and then like this preference is frustrated because I'm killed, that's something that frustrates my preferences, therefore it is wrong. But if I don't have any capacity to form a plan, which is different from not having a plan. There are maybe some people who don't really have any plan, they just live day by day, but they have the capacity to form these plans. That gives me a different moral status. So the fact to attribute mostly like a value to my life, to understand that I am an individual, that what makes the difference. Of course, there is a lot of disagreement about this issue in philosophy. Some people say that what matters is the capacity to feel pain. Some people say it's just simply belonging to a certain species. This has interesting implications, for instance, also for the moral status of other species. So some people say that moral status or the right of living can be attributed only to humans, but some other people like me disagree and think that other species have the same capacity of attributing values to their own life, so they share the same moral status and the right to life.
Right. So I'm sure you discussed this in the article, and then when you published that article back in, you said 2012, around that time frame. What was the public response generally like after you published that article? Was it generally very anti against what you said?
Yeah, mostly I think the people inside of academia, people who have been involved in this debate, which is a debate that is like 50-year-old. So I didn't come up with a new theory. This has been discussed in philosophy for 50 years at this point. People who were not really familiar with the debate in philosophy around that topic, they were pretty shocked and angry about it, and that's understandable because, especially because the newspapers, the magazines, they were talking about, they were reporting the news about the paper, were given a lot of misleading titles. So like, academics want to slaughter babies, which is obviously false. And therefore there was a lot of like anger, which I think was in part due to misunderstanding what we're really claiming. So we're not advocating for killing newborns. That's nothing like that. Some people also misunderstood and thought we were talking about disabled children, but that's not something we were talking about. We were talking about newborns and asking, okay, what happens at birth for people who believe that abortion is morally permissible just right before birth? Why do they think that something happens right at birth? What happens at birth? But of course, like, there were misleading titles, like assuming that it was targeted to disable newborn, which was not the case. So the reaction were quite angry, especially from the non-academic community, but also from the academic community in part. We received lots of death threats, angry emails. I still receive some from time to time, even though I've changed email address in the meantime. So people have to actually find my new email address, since it's not the address on the paper. So there was quite a lot of attention. And I thought it was like the first instance of an academic paper that attracted so much attention from people who were not academics. I've never seen that before, so it was really surprising to us. And then it became more popular over time, but that was the first instance of this attention to academia.
So you state in your conclusion that abortions at an early stage are the best option. Why is this? Do you believe there's a certain significant to the fetal development?
Well, there are various reasons why. So first of all, it is less traumatic for the mother, for the parents, for society. So there is a lot of emotional development attached to having a fetus developing in your womb. So obviously, if a person has the option of having an abortion as soon as possible, using a morning after pill, if they don't want to have a baby, if there is any reason why they want an abortion, intervening as soon as possible is the best option, because there are like less emotional or ethical issues attached to it. So we were not advocating about, like, replacing early term abortion with afterbirth abortion. We're talking about some circumstances under which they might not be possible, but we were mostly talking about the theory behind abortion. So, like, why do we think there is a different moral status at a certain stage of pregnancy, and that status is completely different soon after? So in some countries you can have an abortion up to 9 months. That's legal. In other countries, the legislation is different. So there is, in this respect, a lot of disagreement. In some countries, you can have euthanasia on newborns as well. So like Holland and Belgium, only if the child has some disability in that case. So we were just discussing the ethical assumption at the basis of this difference. But of course, we agree that there are a lot of emotional issues that make an early term abortion a much better option.
Right. So many who agree that early term abortions are ethical state that the quality of subjective experience is what gives life value. To define the term for our listeners, subjective experience is the ability to experience pain and pleasure something with the ability to think and think to develop rational wills and desires. What would your response be to those who use subjective experience as a standard for human value, and do you agree with it?
So these are people who are in favor of early term abortion but against late term abortion?
They believe after 22 to 24 weeks, around that range, when the fetus has developed what neurologists call subjective experience, it is no longer viable for an abortion.
Yeah, a lot of people had that view. I think that, I'm open to that possibility, but I think that the best science available that at the moment suggests that those experiences are not as significant as maybe these people believe. Of course, a fetus becomes sentient, so they develop the capacity to experience pain and so on. But well, first of all, there is a huge question about whether in the womb, regardless of the development of the fetus, they can actually feel pain. And it would appear that because of the substance that are in the water where the baby is, fetuses can't actually experience pain or physical pain or anything. They're like numb. That's an open question, but it seems that there is quite agreement. So if you have an early term birth, so like if this same fetus is born at 24, 25 weeks, so they're out of the womb, they can obviously, since they have the capacity to feel pain that has developed, they can feel pain. So it is just being in the womb that makes a difference in that case. And of course, like any individual who has the capacity of experiencing pain should not be inflicted pain. But that's different from the rights to life or having moral status. So a lot of living creatures which don't have moral status are capable of feeling pain. Animals, all animals pretty much. There is some doubt about insects, but it seems that like all mammals at least, and most likely all other animals can feel pain. Can feel pain. So that means that we should inflict pain on them. But painlessly killing is a different issue from that. So I think there is disagreement there. Of course, the debate is still open, but I think the best evidence available suggests that these other characteristics that I have in mind, like the capacity to attribute a value to your own life, they seem to be more relevant and to be developed way later on, the 24th week or 22nd week.
So, in terms of lobbying for the implementation or at least consideration of the procedures that you proposed in your article, what do you see as the future of legalization for infanticide in countries that currently don't have anything like euthanization of newborns?
Been thinking much. So like this is an article that addresses the philosophical issues around this problem, because it becomes very important, especially when you're thinking about ectogenesis, which is a topic I'm also interested in, which is pregnancy outside of the womb. So what is the moral status of a fetus that develops entirely out of the womb, in an artificial womb? Does it make a difference? So how do we understand that kind of pregnancy? Or what is the moral status of very preterm newborns? What point there should be mandatory to keep them alive? And that age has been moving backwards. So like up to a few years ago, it wasn't really possible to save a 25 weeks preterm newborn. Now this is the norm. So as technology advances, the rules change. So that the discussion is important, looking more at new technologies are not really available yet as ectogenesis. And that's why I think, we should have this conversation. And that's quite something that people have started doing now.
Right. Very interesting. So if economical, social, or psychological circumstances or changes occur such that taking care of the offspring becomes unbearable for the mother, which is obviously something that a lot of people discuss, especially in America, as the abortion argument is really heated right now. It's up there with arguments of government, arguments of gun control. Do you think that people should be given the chance of not being forced to do something that they cannot afford?
Well, look, again, there are obviously a lot of other better options that, people can give a child up for adoption, contraceptives, early term abortion. So there are a lot of options that, especially in countries that are quite rich and advanced, can be more efficient and better for the mother, for the child, for other couples that might be interested in adopting a baby. So there are a lot of other considerations that need to be taken into account. So when we were writing that paper, we were thinking more about how infanticide had been considered, was traditionally in societies like the Romans and the Greeks, that used to be considered permissible, and in other older societies where you didn't have abortion, safe abortion, or other options. And we consider in that cases, there were people who were not capable of avoiding this in any other way. So like then infanticide was a reasonable option. We can understand why some people, some populations in humanity opted for that. Now it would be kind of more difficult to justify it in practical. But again, we're not really talking about the practical issues here. We're just discussing, for people who think that abortion is always permissible up to 9 months, for economic or other reasons, what changes at 9 months? And I think it is a challenge for them to figure out why it's okay up to 3 months, 6 months, 8 months, but then like one day becomes a completely different issue. And appreciate that it is a puzzle, but that's why we are philosophers and not like lawyers, or we're not politicians. So like we deal with the theoretical issues, with the kind of intuitions that people have, and challenge those. So if people think that it's permissible to have an abortion because of economic issues at 3 months, but they still can't justify that something big happens between like 3 months of gestation and 6 and 9, then we need to have a conversation about what happens at birth. And again, this seems quite important when we think of issues like ectogenesis. So what if a person has decide to have a child through ectogenesis, which will become available, I think, in 20 years. But then at some point, they decide to interrupt the ectogenesis process, but then there is no issue of autonomy. So you can't say, oh, I want to have an abortion because I can't carry this baby because the fetus is already in an external body. So how do you justify doing that, even at like 1 week pregnancy or 2 weeks into the pregnancy? These are interesting issues that we need to be able to answer now before ectogenesis become actually available.
Okay.
So like you just said, you researched, civilizations or times where there were societies that saw infanticide as a viable option. do you know whether it was looked down upon by society or recommended against in these times when it was given as an option?
Well, I'm not an historian, so I wouldn't be able to answer the question, but my understanding is that probably it wasn't frowned upon. It was a survival strategy because the resources had to be allocated in a certain way. And now looking at that kind of allocation of resources seems completely immoral, but we need to judge history with different eyes. So we can't understand what is going on in a past society where there are very limited resources and there are maybe many children, and not all of them can survive.
And you conclude the paper specifying that you're not giving a particular cutoff point for afterbirth abortions, but that you're merely extending the logic of abortions beyond birth. Now, I'm not particularly concerned with a cutoff point, but are there qualities a child can develop that would give value to its human life and make it no longer fit as a candidate for afterbirth abortion or infanticide?
I mean, when do we draw the line? Like, as I said in the paper, it is not possible now to, we don't have scientific evidence enough to be able to tell when that happens. It's a process. But, we don't even know exactly when it starts, when it is sufficient, and so on and so forth. But again, like, that's not really a job for philosophers to answer that question. That's a question, it's an empirical issue, and it's not possible to answer that question from a philosophical perspective, because you need to be somebody who understands the development of children in order to understand that. And even that case is quite complicated, because again, you don't go from one state to the other. It's not like turning on and off the light. It's a process, but we really don't know how it works and when that characteristics, when those capacities actually start.
Yeah, I was going to ask because it's very interesting to have, conversations with philosophers on the topic of abortion as opposed to doctors and people specifically in the medical field. What do you think is the importance of the role of philosophers in adding to the conversation of abortion, but also extended to afterbirth abortion?
Well, as I said, again, we need to understand what matters, what makes an abortion morally permissible. We don't have to say necessarily that abortion is permissible in all cases. There might be circumstances in which abortion is not permissible. Which are these cases and why? Why do we think that abortion is permissible at a certain point, up to a certain point, and we need to be able to justify what happens after that? I don't think that doctors always have an answer to that. Like, they can tell us how a fetus develops, which capacity is available. Like, for some people, it's very important to have the capacity to experience pain, to be sentient, but why is that? Doctors can tell us when that happens, but they can't tell us why that's important. We need philosophers with that. And maybe it's not important. Maybe there are other things that are more important or less important. Like, that's a philosophical discussion that needs to be part of the conversation to help understanding an issue like abortion, which is very complicated from a philosophical perspective.
Okay. Well, that's all the time we have for today. We really appreciate you for coming on. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to continue to support us, you can do so by checking out our Instagram pages at Youth in Policy and at Watch Verbum. You can also look at our website at www.yipinstitute.com. Make sure to follow our page as we upload weekly. Have a great day.